Alrighty, guys. So, in the chess openings kind of principles, we talk about controlling the center, right? And I've been doing some games lately where I start with e4 as an idea to control the center and immediately begin to open up lines. My opponent, typically, I've played a lot of games where my opponents responded in kind, controlling the center and limiting my influence. And now a lot of games have kind of developed this way. We've seen where I make a piece move with tempo, attacking this pawn. They make a piece move with tempo, defending their pawn. And then we see things like the Ray Lopez we've been studying lately. We've also seen the Italian game, which I played a little bit. But what happens if we want to? These are what happens with games that develop from an e4 pawn push, the king's pawn. What if we look at queen's pawn games? Now, the idea is I started looking for something different, right? I started looking for something that, okay, I'm learning some games with e4. So if I see my opponent playing e4, I know some pretty standard ideas on how to respond, and I know some pretty common ways that I can look at responding to my opponent's moves. What happens if my opponent leads with d4? Then what happens? Well, you get into there's many lines that can develop from d4, but one of the ones I'm going to look at is the Queen's Gambit lines. The idea is exactly the same. We push a pawn to control the center squares, right? My opponent, a lot of times, will push a pawn to limit white's control. And then you'll see this move. We see a c4 pawn move. Now, the idea here is that we're immediately attacking black's control of the center. So the idea we're looking for here is we're going to maybe capture this pawn, right? And we'll take back control from the black pieces. Now, this is called a gambit line because we are basically giving up a pawn for free. My opponent can simply take this pawn that's undefended, and they've flat out won a pawn. This would be known as the Queen's Gambit accepted. So we are accepting that gambit. We are taking the pawn. So QGA, Queen's Gambit accepted. What can happen from here? Well, there's a lot of things that could happen from here. But one example would be to basically strengthen the center, open up our light square bishop, so that our light square bishop can then take that pawn back and get our gambited pawn back. Now, if my opponent wants to maintain control of that pawn, they can push a pawn themselves, and now they are strengthening theirs. But notice they are shifting slightly away from the center, so we are forcing black a little bit off the center line, a little bit, and gives white a little bit more influence over the center than black does. Now, one of the other things that could develop from here is we make an a4 pawn move. Now we are looking to undermine black's pawn structure. So these two pawns are the strongest pieces that right now that black has in the game. It's early in the game, obviously, but the strongest things that are happening in the game is this pawn structure. So we can immediately start undermining it. So this is one line that can develop from the Queen's Gambit accepted. There are many, but this is just one, and something that we can look at in our games. And the reason I'm going through this process is because this is how I am trying to improve my gameplay by looking at not just what these moves are, but why these moves are. So this pawn structure here, well, we can attack the base of that chain, and by attacking the base of that chain, we then weaken the head of the chain. And that's something that we can take to all of our games. As we're playing chess, if we see a pawn chains are very strong, we know this. But if you can attack the base of the chain, then you weaken the strength, you weaken the rest of the chain. Now from here, let's say that black were to defend. There's a couple ways that black can defend, but one that I want to point out is if black were to, say, take with, or try to defend the pawn chain, right? We're going to strengthen this pawn chain by pushing c6. This is an example of a line that can happen. White takes on b5. Black takes, recaptures with their c pawn, and now they have re-solidified that pawn chain. But the one thing that they've done now is look at the weakness here on black's queen side. You have this possibility here. notice that rook is trapped. That rook cannot go anywhere. And so our queen is looking at a free rook. Is it really a free rook? Not exactly, because you could have something like this where black moves their knight to c6, which cuts off the influence. Well, I'm going to steal that knight real quick. My opponent is now in check, and they can drop a bishop here to defend against that check, but also open up a defense of the rook. So at which point in time, I would just have to move my queen. Let's say I could drop it all the way back to f3. I can move it over to a6. Whichever. There's several options that you could do with your queen. But at this moment in time, white has now weakened black's queen side and is up a full knight in the exchange. I mean, not an exchange, just up a free knight. So the Queen's Gambit accepted is an interesting line. And the Queen's Gambit accepted is essentially if white moves their c pawn to challenge the center and black captures it, that's the Queen's Gambit, and now we have black takes it, Queen's Gambit accepted. And then immediately we strengthen our center, black will try to strengthen theirs, and then we start undermining. And if you undermine this c6, if you're on the receiving end of this, let's say you're playing the black pieces, do not push this c6 pawn. This is a mistake you do not want to do. Instead, look for other ways to defend. Let's go back. Let's look at a slightly different move set. Delete all that. So if d captures on c4, and then white tries to strengthen their pawn structure, black can then just fall back on basic principles, right? Black can simply go knight f6, which is just basically trying to regain influence on the center. This pawn is out there and could be recaptured at some point in time. And so now that gambit, we gambited the pawn, but we've got it back, so we're back even in material at this point in time. And then black can continue with something along this line. Notice now we've got an attack on the queen, but we are defended. And then simply we could do something like a knight f3. So developing and blocking. Now notice that this is a more common structure that we'll see, because you don't have a lot of those extraneous pawn pushes, right? If the chess opening principles say, hey, don't make a bunch of pawn pushes, right? There's no need to push a bunch of pawns needlessly. So that first line we looked at, where you have all those pawns running around, is kind of a weak opening anyway, right? You're going against the principles, where this is a little bit more standard principled move set. One of the things to look at here from this standpoint, this Queen's Gambit accepted, we are even in material, right? White and black have exactly the same amount of material on the board. There's nothing hanging. There's nothing hanging. Everything is defended. This bishop can comfortably move back if it needs to, or it could even be defended, something like this. But one of the things I want to point out is look at the pawn structure. So black has given up one of their central pawns, right? Black has traded away their d pawn for white's c pawn. So white has two pawns in the center. Black only has one pawn in the center. This is a very minuscule difference, right? But when we start playing better and better games, it's these small advantages that we're looking to add up over time. So this is just something I wanted to kind of point out as far as some of the Queen's Gambit type positions that can open up. And again, the Queen's Gambit is simply what happens when we open up with a d4 pawn, right? We open up with a d4 pawn, we can expect to see some kind of response. And then here, now we've accepted the gambit. And from here, like I said, I would continue. If I were white, I would develop with tempo. I now have got a nice solid pawn chain on white side, and I am attacking this pawn. From black standpoint, they can either defend the pawn. Notice that they would have to, if they were to move, let's say, a bishop here to defend the pawn, it does block in their king pawn. So their own king pawn is blocked in, which makes it a little more difficult to develop their dark square bishop. So it is something to consider. So there are a few ways to defend this pawn, but some of the most common would be to push a pawn, which is less principled, but more likely they're just going to let that pawn go, right? We know that from black standpoint, I'm up a pawn. So from black standpoint, if I drop that pawn back down, it's not the end of the world. This early in the game, giving back that pawn is not the end of the world. I get free development out of it. And my opponent, when my opponent takes, I get more free development. So now I've developed 2 pieces. I can then open up my dark square bishop, and I can have both of my bishops out and free and not trapped. Whereas white side does have a little bit of trap here, right? There's a little bit of issues that we have to figure out how to get our dark square bishop out. Notice, even if we were to, say, go with a fianchetto line with our dark square bishop, we're still kind of blocked in. So white standpoint, this dark square bishop is a little bit weaker, where black standpoint, giving back the pawn does mean that they can open up both of their bishops, have both bishops on, semi-influential diagonals, and they're able to develop with tempo. So that's just one example of the Queen's Gambit accepted. A lot of times what you can also see, I'm going to pause and delete all this. I'll be right back. All right, let's see. So one of the other options we can look at is the Queen's Gambit declined. So again, we open up the exact same way, d4, d5, and then c4. But instead of black taking right away, right, what if black chooses not to take, right? They know that this exchange could happen, but they don't have to take. What if they were to, say, just go e6? Defend the pawn. That's principled as well, because we develop with tempo. We've solidified our pawn chain, and we've defended that loose pawn. Okay. What typically happens from here is we'll just leave that tension, right? If in ooh, excuse me, if in this case, if white were to take and black takes back, notice now that it's the same situation, right? So white has given up a wing pawn or an outside pawn for one of black's central pawns, and black is kind of weakened in front of their king, but at the same time, there's really no development yet. So that's one thing that could develop. You could continue on with propping up your pawn. You could try to get your light square bishop out, but notice this square is taken away. If an opponent were to play, say, a c6 pawn move and take away the rest of these, you limit the influence of the light square bishop, so you're giving back control of the center to the black side. So white could take back this pawn, but it is most likely, or in most cases, I should say, it is better for white to leave the tension. Leave this tension for now. We'll resolve it later, and we'll follow up with some other moves. So let's go ahead and just continue to make standard developing moves. We're going to develop. We're going to continue. So now we've got 2 attackers here. White still has 2 defenders. Black can develop with tempo, right? Just go ahead and preparing to castle king side and getting a knight out. And then we could do something like a bishop g5. So now white is getting very strong development here. We are pinning this knight. Notice it's now adding another defender to the central pawn. So this is kind of what develops, right? We're still looking at controlling the center one way or another. These standard developing moves end up looking very similar to like a Ruy Lopez type structure, except flipped, right? Instead of it being this bishop pinning a knight on this side, now we've got the dark square bishop pinning a knight toward the queen. The only major difference from those lines is we now have this pawn out in front, right? The Ruy Lopez lines, the Italian lines, the knight ends up going in front of the pawn, whereas here we have the pawn out in front of the knight. So it does allow for a little bit of more aggressive pawn structure in the center. You are controlling more squares in the center. So this is why, one of the reasons why white would look for an opening like this, right? We're trying to control more squares in the center. And as we develop our pieces, we can develop with tempo and still maintain a ton of control. Oop. There's the garbage truck again. I always seem to do these videos when the garbage truck's coming around. So I lost my train of thought. Anyway, we're developing a pawn up away from the back line. We have gotten it central control, and we are able to still develop our pieces with tempo. Black is okay with this because, again, the same thing. They've got a good pawn structure. They're not having to push extra pawn moves. There will be a little bit of a challenge for Black's light square bishop, but a fianchetto from this side of the board is not so bad because it takes this entire long diagonal and it still keeps this pawn chain intact. Whereas if we do the Queen's Gambit lines from the white side to this fianchetto line, notice there's no third pawn. All right, that C pawn has been pushed and either captured or is maintaining tension. So you don't have that actual full pawn chain, the full pawn base. Whereas the black side would have this full, the full structure there to make that fianchetto stronger. So, again, just some thought processes on these. This is a line. Let me delete this move here. This is an opening that I have seen quite a bit, and I start looking for it when I was playing games earlier. I see these whenever I make a d4 opening. You'll end up seeing this kind of pawn structure. These two knights typically end up here. A lot of times you'll see this knight get involved in the game as well, right? So from White's standpoint, the king side knight will end up on f3. The queen side knight will end up on c6. You can even transpose into this. I've seen that a lot. I'm going to delete all this. So, for instance, let's say White were to push the d4. Black responds with knight f6 immediately. Now, this is, like I said, this is one of the named openings called the Indian, and you'll see it transpose into the Queen's Gambit. From here, White will go ahead and push a pawn. Black will respond with their e6 pawn, and sometimes you'll even see White will go with their f3 pawn or f3 knight, followed finally by the d5 pawn. This is the Nimzo or anti-Nimzo Indian, and then finally you'll see the c3 pawn, the c3 knight move. So we've transposed into the Queen's Gambit declined. I have seen this type of opening quite a bit. I've played several games where I pushed a d4 pawn, or my opponent has, and I responded with a knight move. This is a flexible move. I can immediately, from my standpoint, since I don't know enough of these fancy openings, and I don't know enough of these, and I don't have the memorization to know all these specific things, this is a flexible opening that allows Black to open up in multiple ways, right? They can continue on with some of these Indian games, which are extremely strong, or Nimzo Indians. Or from my perspective, I'm almost always going to follow up with these pawns. So I might change the move order for this opening and go in this order, where my opponent plays. So I might change that order. You notice here, now we've transitioned to the Queen's Gambit declined. But those are just some things to look for when you do these openings. All right? Oh, and finally, I want to talk about one last thing. Let's continue this basic line just a little bit longer. And I'm going to show you one thing. From here, like I said, there are a couple of options. This knight for both players can go up. What I will typically do, and one of the things that I've started trying to play, is notice that when we close this pawn chain, right? When we close this pawn chain, we block in our dark square bishop. So one of the things I've been trying to figure out is what to do with this dark square bishop. Most likely you end up pinning here. From here, yeah, even in the games that are played, it looks like there's not an H pawn move to drive it away, not until like the 5th or 6th most common move. So this bishop can get out and be comfortable, and then we can close that pawn chain. So most common move here would be my opponent to put some defense along that line so they're not having to mess up their queen structure. Notice the opponent is now ready to castle. So if you're playing the black pieces, your dark square bishop can easily sit on e7, sitting opposite that white's dark square bishop. And then you see the e3 pawn move, which now we open up our light square bishop. Black can castle. And this is one of the things I wanted to mention is there is a tempo situation here. Notice black at any point in time could capture this pawn. White's plan to recapture the pawn is to take back with the bishop. If we do it now, white gets that bishop move with tempo, right? They get to develop with tempo. So what black likes to do from this standpoint is go ahead and castle, or make another move, right? You could even make, let's say, a knight move or something. But don't resolve this tension just yet. Go ahead and make a move. And then as white begins to start developing their pieces, okay, because we know white wants to castle. I'm still not, from the black standpoint, I'm still not resolving this tension yet. I'm just making a developing move. Now, for white to castle, it really needs to go ahead and get this bishop out of the way. So let's move the bishop. Now, once white has moved that bishop, now we can take, and now black has to waste another tempo. So we have been able to get basically a free move out of the deal. We've gotten a developing move or a castling move before we resolved that. So white had to move once, twice for the same move, and now white is ready to castle. So from black's standpoint, if you see your opponent playing the Queen's Gambit and you want to go with the declined variation, let that tension sit, let that tension percolate until you see it. Ideally, you want to see white make a bishop move and then resolve that tension, because now you're forcing them to waste the tempo, right? So while that tension sits there, you're able to make moves and make other moves, and then you'll only resolve that tension after they've wasted a move. So keep that in your bag of tricks. If the black pieces and your opponent's playing the Queen's Gambit, wait for them and then resolve it, and then they can take back. Obviously they can get their pawn back, but they've already wasted a tempo in the process. So those are just some things to look at from the d4 pawn openings, the Queen's Gambit. Like I said, I have been enjoying the Queen's Gambit declined lines. You'll see games that I play that if I'm the white pieces, I'm going to go d4, then c4. You'll see, and if I'm playing the black pieces, I'll go knight f6, then e6, then finally d5. So keep those in your bag of tricks. Keep them in mind, and then I'm going to try to get some games moving forward where we can kind of explore this a little bit and see how they, like, this is theory, right? So what's the difference between theory and practice? Well, in theory, practice, wait, how does it go? Whatever, you know what I'm talking about. In theory, our games in reality should go like this, right? But the reality is it's not going to go like this. There's always going to be, there's too many move variations, and so we're going to see a lot of things. But when we were studying the Ruy Lopez, right, we got, 3 or 4 games in a row that were like the exact same move set for the first 5 or 6 or 7 moves. And we were able to then look for improvements as we went. So maybe we'll get the same thing here, right? We'll play some games and see how they develop. But we know that in the back of our head, the thought process, the theory is, if my opponent is playing with Queen's Gambit, I can let that tension sit there and I don't have to resolve it, and I can continue to develop. And if I really, 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 really want to, play some interesting lines, we can go for the Queen's Gambit accepted, and maybe see what could develop from there, right? Maybe it just allows us to force our opponent to start developing, right? We force our opponent to make a knight move before they want to. And maybe we can look at getting some other development while my opponent is trying to, scramble to get back this pawn. I don't know, but we'll see. We'll see what's gonna happen. I'm gonna try to play some games. My goal is to play some Queen's Gambit declined variations. I find those to be a little bit more fun for my style, or at least I have in the past. So I'm gonna try to get some of those, and we'll look at them. But this gives us an option if we're playing games. We've got some tools in our tool belt for e4 pawn openings, right? King's pawn openings. Now we're going to try to see if we can get some queen's pawn games in, and see how those develop. All right, guys, I'll catch you later. Bye.